Hopefully you're all energized after a couple or a few days now of EclipseCon. We're going to be diving into something really exciting, the tribulations of trying to get your software into enterprises, whether that be something you're producing yourself or whether that be something you're working with. I'm Tim Webb. I'm the Director of Innovation and Sales Strategy over at Genuitec. And let's just dive right into it. So let's start off by setting the stage. You are producing a product, you're producing a plugin, you're trying to create an entity that you're going to deliver, hopefully, to enterprises that are out there. Enterprises are awesome for you. Am I pacing too much with the camera? No, the enterprises are awesome opportunities, but they have unique challenges that go with them. Enterprises have a lot of established policies about how your software is used, and the Eclipse platform itself has distinct challenges that come as a result of working in that environment. So if we think about a traditional Eclipse, how does it normally operate? You have certain things you assume about perhaps where it can be installed, about how it's going to connect out to the network, about how it's going to access resources that it expects to have available. And what happens when you take that behind the enterprise is all those preconceived expectations about the plugins you build or the plugins you're depending on can start to fail. So for instance, let's say you had an update site for your software and say, cool, let's go install that behind the firewall. What happens when the resources for that update site are not available? Now your dependent plugins fail to load. As you expand out that problem from the basic updates to the resources you expect to have there, your software can start to fail. And ultimately what you want is when your users consume your software that they're going to have a positive experience. So this talk is about how you're going to be able to appropriately address your software or prepare your software, understand your exposure so that when you go out and you have your software being consumed, it can effectively be consumed. During the talk, I have a couple tags for both plugin people and product people, trying to make it clear, which ones are most applicable. Though ultimately, and we'll get there at the end, is depending on who you're deploying to. Say you're deploying to certain verticals, say automotive, very large here. There's certain things you can expect to encounter. There's other disciplines that may have zero connectivity outside the firewall if you're dealing with security or banking. So as we go through, let's dive in. Why are we here? We've been doing software delivery for many years. We were part of the committees starting P2. We have our own commercial product secure delivery center. I'm not here to pitch that, don't worry. We'll be talking about general solutions you can do for your technology. But this is based on going to, I think we have 70% of the Fortune 100 customers, 70% of the Fortune 100 are customers of ours. It's hard delivering across that array of desktops and enterprises. So as we think about the enterprise and we're building software for it, we have to kind of deconstruct the challenges we're going to have. And we can think about those in sort of three different buckets. The first one is a desktop. The actual my software is going to run on a particular system. What's that going to be like for an enterprise system? What do you need to know about your software? The second one is going to be the network. You can't go outside the firewall, or maybe there's an NTL and proxy in your way. And so we want to talk about how you can, what APIs to use, how you think about building your network connections so that your software can, whether it's check for updates, download a Maven artifact, whatever it may be. And finally, the environment. There's certain things that are intrinsic to each enterprise regarding the working environment, and we'll end up on the enterprise environment. As we go through this, we'll be focusing on specific solutions to these problems. So you're not here to hear me just talk about, man, this is hard. No, we want to talk about how we can make it better for you. So our first one, again, is this desktop. It's awesome, it's cool. There's lots of desktops in enterprises. Who doesn't want a 10,000 seat license? But coming with all those seats are challenges. The first one are the end users. Yay, they're a challenge. These end users are the first ones that are going to touch your software, but they have certain expectations about how your software should work based on their experiences in the enterprise. Any large organization is going to have a standard way of getting you software, of maybe having a portal where you can see your software catalog, of promoting software for a team. And so it becomes very important as you build your software to understand that this isn't a greenfield environment. You're not just going into some new laptop somewhere. You're going into an environment where people are used to working a certain way. So your first takeaway is understanding that the environment is shared. So one of the first things is, you will have different ways of the user getting your software. So we talked about a portal. So if you're going to have a portal, in what format does it need to be available? Is it a TGZ for Linux 32 and Linux 64? Is that even appropriate for the corporate portal? Or does it need to be an installer? Do you need to worry about picking up an IZ pack or a commercial solution? So making sure your software can be deployed in the environment where the IT department, where the users are going to expect it. The second part is obviously a simple one, branding. We're starting very soft. We'll get more technical in a minute, obviously. But the branding is an important one. It helps the company provide value to their users. So why are they going to get, say, a corporate Eclipse? Instead of go to eclipse.org. They're going to go there because they're getting a branded, tailored IDE for them. Part of that is making sure your product is clearly, call it enhanced, even if it's just the centralized one. But when things get really tricky is actually how the software runs, right? So let's move beyond kind of the abstract. On an average enterprise desktop, you may have all sorts of different constraints, all the way from only being able to execute programs from C:\program files, but the user has no permissions to actually copy any files there, right? It's 100% controlled. The second one could be that there's certain directories they have to write to for local storage. So instead of their home directory, Eclipse is nice. If it's read-only, it will go out to the home directory. But what happens when you start putting all your content in the home directory? Well, organizations are going to have quotas. They're going to have restrictions regarding how much software is there. So when you're building up your product, expect that you need to allow that enterprise to tailor, to pre-configure, if you will, those paths so that it comes up and detects, oh, they use m:\dev. And so we're going to try to make sure that the software will understand and use m:\dev workspace. As we get into that kind of lockdown environment, you want to be able to create your software to be as flexible as possible. The important one, though, is not just being flexible, is understanding how to gracefully fall back. So if your software expects to be able to update itself or expects to be able to download things locally, and your user's running in a place where they don't have any permissions, are you notifying, hey, I couldn't do updates? Or are you able to either disable or allow those updates to fall back and run in an alternate way? And we'll get in a bit deeper as we go along here. To address those delivery concerns of how do I get my software there, then you have to provide flexibility in your installation options, right? You may need to provide an update site for them to put into their existing Eclipses they're already packaging. Or you may need, if you're providing your own product, you need to be able to provide an installation mechanism that will deliver everything you expect to be there. In an organization, it's very common to want to provide some amount of tracking, auditing, accountability of the software delivery. And so you need to make sure that your software has a monitorable installation experience. Again, just having a TGZ file up somewhere isn't sufficient. When we start getting into updates, though, the challenge becomes a bit more complex. Some companies will say, I don't know if any of you have done this, will push out, say, an image of an Eclipse via a network mount, or push it out through an SMS system where they're automatically managing the software distribution. But what happens at that point when you go to update the software and product? So let's say you have permissions in this case, and the user wants to be able to get live over-the-air updates. Your Eclipse, if it then self-updates, will then perhaps break your subsequent update through SMS. How do you allow the flexibility of plugins to be managed? So when you're building your installer, when you're packaging up your Eclipse, you want to do that in such a way that the P2 metadata, the infrastructure, is all compatible so that whether it's an install-based installation or whether you're doing an over-the-air install, the two will work well together. The next challenge is that a lot of enterprises are looking for ways to optimize the developers. They're going to provide you a virtualized environment. Maybe you come in and you connect and you're like, really cool, I can do my development, everything's already there. If your software is going to be compatible in that, there are opportunities for you to make your software really performant. And I'm going to dive right into more of the solution diagram as we're talking. There's different types of virtualization you'll get exposed to in the enterprise. One is a kind of the Citrix or Windows Terminal Server style, where it's kind of a shared resource. In some cases, it's a full virtual machine where you can have an entire isolated stack. In those cases, for the enterprise, if you have a very large product or you're working on a large system, it becomes very advantageous to be able to allow your software to run in an optimized method for that virtualized desktop. So if we take a look at the diagram, we can see there's typically different performance characteristics based on where you're writing software. So when you're accessing a virtualized desktop and you're connecting out to it, your home directory may be remote. You may have your data center in Frankfurt and a development team in London. That London development team will often have their user directories close to their computer. If you start, say, writing out to the home directory for everything, it can be quite slow. So as you go into an enterprise, understanding where files should actually be archived or stored can really make a huge difference. If you haven't actually tried to do it, running Eclipse over a high latency link is horrendous. There's all these plugins, all these network accesses that have to occur to get your Eclipse up and running. And so by being able to say, hey, you know what, we can take a subset of the plugins or the high use plugins or the default plugins and have those on a shared mount, for instance, in that virtual cluster that is very high performance, so that when your Eclipse comes up, it's really fast, but you're not requiring a gigabyte or whatever it may be of all your plugins on each virtual machine. Obviously, if you have 1,000 developers or 5,000 developers going to a cluster, you can very quickly burn disk space, especially if they have different virtual environments they need to work with. But the hardest one, though, and this is where we've had the most fun, and we've gone to the point of purchasing commercial network stacks, is dealing with all the proxies that are out there. One of our customers, for instance, in kind of worst case, just to authenticate with a proxy was a 45-second timeout. So you give the credentials, and it would take 45 seconds to get the answer back from the proxy. And it's like, wow, how can we even do that? Our connect timeouts were expected to be 30 seconds. And so I'm going to give a couple strategies that can help. What I will say is, it's a great conversation to have if you have certain expectations about the network. Understand what you're going to be exposed to there. Ultimately, the idea is to make your software turnkey, right? So that you can sell it to any enterprise and it continues to work. So what's your first challenge? Your first challenge is you have a firewall. You can't get through it. You want to be able to have your software update or whatever it may be. You're not going to be able to, right? So the interesting challenge is Eclipse is all about plugins, about components, about models, about frameworks, about interdependency. As you're assembling your software for delivery, you need to make sure that what you expect to be there is not only your plugins in your update site, because they may not have access to an Eclipse discovery site or your dependent reference sites in your update site. Instead, you want to have all of those dependencies bundled in to your update site so that you can guarantee a successful installation experience. If you're doing a product and you're doing kind of over-the-air product updates, it's very similar. You want to have a fully contained update site that you can provide. Now, when you talk about updates, the next logical thing is there's resources. You have certain expectations. Maybe it's things to help an editor validate. Maybe it's you're going out to Maven repositories. You want to be able to build your software in such a way that you can traverse, again, the network correctly. Now, there's two parts to how to think about resources. One is, I need to write to the right network API, I need to get out of the firewall. The other way to say, I can make it very easy for somebody on the IT side to take a pack of my resources and put them available on the network. If you do that, if you provide that pack and then allow your software to easily point to that pack, you provide an opportunity for the software to run more efficiently because it's coming behind the firewall. And you don't require those users, say, to put in a password for their proxy because they have to log in every time, they can't remember it, or whatever it may be. So providing that pack, that kind of set of resources, and more importantly then allowing them to automatically deploy that configuration makes it easier for them to use your software. When you're doing that, when you're working on resources, remember though that there's things you depend on, frameworks, plugins, whatever it may be. You also at that time want to be able to make sure everything you depend on isn't going out. So obviously I'm sure you all do it, but test your software with no network connectivity, make sure you're up and running correctly. The hardest part of the network is the API. Everything can be a bit different in Eclipse. There's many different ways to establish a network connection. Do you use ECF? Do you use a straight Java connection? Depending on your choice, it has ramifications, again, to how your software is used. At the most fundamental level, if you're building a plugin going into an existing Eclipse, consider what people are likely using. So if you're doing a team provider and it works in conjunction with Git, for instance, model it after the Git approach. But getting a bit more kind of concrete on the proxy. If you're using, for instance, an NTLM server, I don't know if you're familiar with NTLM, it's a type of proxy that comes from a Microsoft IIS server. There are a couple other implementations. What's interesting with NTLM is if you're on an Active Directory enabled enterprise, that your Java connection can automatically traverse a proxy without requiring credentials. Whereas if you use the default of HTTP client inside Eclipse, HTTP client is going to challenge because it can't piggyback off of some of the proxy settings. Secondly, HTTP client has different levels of compatibility with NTLM and other proxy servers. So if you're using an NTLM v2 with a particular version of HTTP client, again, it doesn't connect correctly. You have to go out of your way to support NTLM. So what I strongly recommend is if you're building a plugin or building a product, if there's something you can build on top of that already does that, it makes it significantly better. So first one is there's the iProxy data from the CoreNet API. If you can leverage ECF's understanding of how to go to the network, that's compatible with things like P2 for your update mechanism or whatever else you may be leveraging. It also means you're going to be standard, so your user's not getting sort of different network problems. I mean, I don't know if you've ever gone to an enterprise where you see somebody type in like 3 or 4 times their proxy, and man, that is painful. We don't want people to have to do that with our software. So again, align your software to plugins that matter most for your particular use cases. Speaking of those network APIs, I was talking a bit about HTTP client and Java. Inside Eclipse, do you have ways of disabling a particular one? Do you want your users to be aware of that decision? So if it's possible, one really nice approach, and this one we use ourselves, is attempt to establish connections with different ones quickly. So you can say, hey, I can try JavaNet, I can try HTTP client, say, oh cool, all right, JavaNet can go straight outside without asking, whereas HTTP client has to actually challenge. Cool, okay, now I know that. HTTP client is a bit more robust when it comes to actually retries and maintaining proper connections. So there's distinct benefits. You don't want to just say, okay, we'll only use low-level JavaNet, because then you're doing things differently than perhaps other plugins that are running. So now HTTP client and Eclipse is doing proxy one way and you're doing it another. At the same time, you want to use the technology will get you through the firewall in the easiest way. The next part to talk about is the environment. The environment. Inside an enterprise, there are many opportunities and challenges that come with the process, the world you live in. Just kind of an anecdote, you're selling software to an enterprise, you're not going to be able to, the person you're speaking to is likely not going to be your purchasing agent, right? They're going to have somebody else you have to work with. They have to understand how applicable your software is. So very simply, you know, we had one customer who was going and had a architectural review board that was scheduled quarterly, and there were only so many things they could discuss, and you have a long wait while you're waiting for the software to be acquired, even after a good technical decision. So by understanding the corporate environment, you're able to take advantage of the opportunities that provides. So, first challenge is the data center. Let's say you have a server element, or you have a certain resources you want to have available. A common question we get by people or enterprises we're talking to is, does your software talk to the internet? It's like this dreaded concern of, oh no, you're going to go out and then everything's going to break when we try to use it. Or more importantly, for security reasons, they don't want your software reaching out. So you have this data center, and you have your software, and you want to get it there, and like, awesome, we're going to get my software in the data center. And then how do they install it? And so in a data center environment is often totally disconnected from the people who have evaluated your software. Say, great, we're going to deploy it. Now we're going to put it in the data center. Somebody else has to do the install. So if your software has kind of a client-server model, making sure that all those elements that you're going to be requiring are easily there. So when we talk about the internet in the data center, it's a challenge in that your software can't go out, and that has certain kind of ramifications as we were talking about. So one of the ones that you have to take into account is the fact that all of your software needs to be easily installable. So if you have a server component, is it going to be able to, excuse me, do you mind grabbing me a glass of water? Thank you. Is allowing those components to operate fully disconnected. So let's say that server component, that model, you're going to have a sysadmin who needs to come along and install it, and they're going to need to activate it. So again, a very simple way of getting the software into the data center. The simplicity is really key, right? Because these are not Eclipse experts. They may not know what an Eclipse update site is. They are somebody who's a system admin, and their job is just to get your software, or the software that they were asked to install for somebody in the company, installed as quickly as possible. And so by having a very simple install script perhaps an installer, an RPM, whatever your particular demographic is, make sure that that's turnkey. The challenge, though, is those data centers are constrained. Like, you're not going to, oh no, we work with Red Hat, we don't do Ubuntu, or we have a Windows server, not a Linux backend. Those data centers are out of your control. They're going to have the operating system they have. We have our own customers just with an array of backends, and many have just, our data centers are all Windows, our data centers are all Linux. Haven't found any Mac ones yet, but they are constrained. So you say, okay, cool, now we got to test our software on Windows Server 2008 or whatever they happen to be running. Just running inside that environment, again, is a challenge. The good thing is you can control it. It's in your destiny. So now you're into installing. Your system admin is like, awesome, all right, let's get this software in the network. Let's get the software deployed. They don't know your software. How can they do the configuration? If you're asking them lots of questions at install time about, hey, what ports, or what version of HTTP client, or God, what you may be asking, but if you had a whole bunch of questions and you require that to just get your product installed, you're now requiring that knowledge for the system admin, right? So what you want to do is think about decoupling your installation and configuration experience. Thank you. So you have that installation's being completed. And now somebody else needs to configure it. Now, let's again take that example of, say, a Linux box, and you don't have connectivity. You cannot get shell access. That's where kind of the web world of, I drag down my WordPress and it takes me through a web portal is a great model to think about in terms of configuring your software, that it walks you through the configuration after the software has been deployed. By doing that, you allow the person who evaluated, tested, likes your software, the opportunity of configuring it after the fact. So installation's done on the network, you're ready to go. Apologize, I had a bit too much fun yesterday and my voice is struggling a bit. Oh boy, all right, so now you're in this environment and it's a shared environment. You're not on your own, right? You have to coexist. Wonderful word. You're going into an Eclipse that is already there if you're creating a plugin. You're going to a desktop that already has software on it. When you're thinking about deploying to an Eclipse, the first thing I'll tell you about enterprises is they are notoriously slow to move forward. They're not going to be running on 4.3 always. A lot of times you'll find them on an older version. So what you want to do is structure your software to allow success in that environment. Now, if we think about one of the first things your software may tackle is, hey, maybe you have a login mechanism. Maybe you're doing some collaboration software. It's really cool to do that. It's nice to be able to provide that value. However, an enterprise already has logins. They already have people's passwords and things, and they don't want to mirror yet another copy. So make sure you're building your software, if you have, say, authentication dependencies, to hook in with what's already there. So provide Active Directory integration, provide LDAP integration, allowing you to leverage their existing infrastructure. When you're doing that, though, there's kind of a temptation. Oh, I'll get everything from there. Maybe I have groups I want to allow management of, or in our case, we allow organic management of teams for delivering packages to. If you're doing that and you rely on, say, oh, cool, we'll put those into LDAP, you're now asking that there be a change to LDAP, right? What you want to be able to do is make sure that your software can have its own kind of roles and assignment and grouping mechanisms inside it while delegating to the external system for all your authentication. So I mentioned to have an installed IDE. What does that mean? Why does it matter that they already have an IDE there installed? Well, okay, it could be old. It could be they're running 3.6. 3.6 is an amazingly popular version of Eclipse. I don't know how often people say, we still work on 3.6. Or they have an RCP built on 3.6. Kind of is when it had its awesome moment of a great stable platform. People loved it. People know it works. Your plugins should be able to be compatible with older versions. Especially, you look at other commercial vendor IDEs, they sometimes have an every other year kind of update. If you go out there and say, we're going to support 4.2 and 4.3, expecting to have success when you go out into an enterprise, you're likely to find many groups are on an older version, either because the tools they built in-house require that, commercial tools they chose still require it. So you have all these interdependencies. So, okay, cool, all right, we can build our plugin for 3.6 and later, or whatever may be appropriate based on your market. But you also do have dependencies. So it's an unfortunate accident is going in there and saying, hey, letting the plugin development environment let you add the version of the thing you depend on, for instance, overly restricting the versions of stuff. So if you have a core element, take the example of HTTP client again, and you go in there tightly constrained, it must be this version, it becomes much harder for your software to be deployed with other plugins that also require that common component. So as you just build your plugins, do so in such a way that the dependencies that matter are constrained, and the ones that don't aren't, because again, one of the hardest challenges is you don't know what they're going to deploy with. It could be commercial offerings, they could be their own homegrown solutions. You don't want to limit the deployment of your software just because something else is there that already said, no, I want this HTTP client. So, we've talked a lot about these problems, and so what we want to focus on is now, succeeding, right? So we have an Eclipse, and the kind of the nirvana that we want to end up with is we have our nice Eclipse, we have our resources now mirrored behind the firewall so that everything will function. We've taken the update size behind the firewall. So let's just focus a little more on updates. Those updates behind the firewall allow your product to have a great installation experience and then update experience. So any enterprise that's deploying your software in volume is going to need a way to manage and update that installation. So if you can provide a mirror of your update site, and more importantly, some facilities inside your product to help the update, it makes it much better. The typical example is, the normal help check for updates, or maybe somebody's enabled for a schedule. It's very easy for people to ignore, to turn off, to forget to check, and you can end up with all these different versions of your software all out of control. And in the enterprise, I'm sure they'll love to have your newest software out there benefiting everyone in the organization. So if you have a way to leverage some of the APIs or leverage a solution to efficiently get your updates out, you make it easy not only to get your software consumed, but for those users to continue to get the benefits. You wouldn't want to have a newer version, new capability that you aren't able to get out to the users. So if we kind of think about those, and then stepping back, what are the high points you want to take away? Is that you want to be able to leverage infrastructure where it's there, so in whatever form, leverage technologies, platforms, frameworks, whether it's ECF, whether it's a commercial product. You want to be able to leverage ones that are proven to work in the enterprise. Back to the keynote about, one of the keynotes about maturity. Those keynotes are, they really do make a key point. You want to use software that works well. So back to, say, a network library. You may find a really cool network library online. If you go grab it and it hasn't been proven in an NTLM server that takes 45 seconds to go to Krakow and back to respond to a payload, your software will have very odd behaviors. So again, understand what you can leverage, and then where you can't leverage, make sure you build with these concerns in mind. Next is you will be selling to a vertical. You have a product, maybe you're building something for automotive if you're here, lots of automotive talks. Understand the constraints in a particular vertical. So for instance, in automotive, concerns come into play like, can I get the older versions of my plugins because I must have a reproducible environment to do development with? I want to be able to have certain security constraints for my network. So a lot of times when you're building, obviously, embedded software, it becomes very important to know this is exactly what I have, that my people are developing with the right software, that we're not getting exposure by incorrect tools. So if you understand the vertical, you can start to make certain decisions based on that. So I can say, hey, okay, I'm selling to banks. Banks aren't going to want their RCP for stock traders or whatever it may be reaching out to the internet. There's likely, well, I don't know in that example actually if they have connectivity. Let's say one of our clients is a travel agent. In their case, there's no network access. The only thing they can do is process bookings over the phone. And in that context of that RCP, we know the security model that they're going to have, right? They're going to be locked down. These are going to be people who don't know Eclipse. They're not going to understand what an RCP is. All they want is a product. So then we can optimize our software for the verticals, for the sort of model you're going to. And then the last point is build flexibly. So, think about those resources, again, behind the firewall. You have those cool abstract ways to update your product via these resources. Maybe you allow a repository of source code or whatever it is you connect to. If those could, say, be pre-configured so that instead of each engineer going to configure the corporate configuration, Make sure your software can be deployed perhaps with preferences in the configuration folder if you're doing a product. Or if you're doing a plugin, could you have an extra metadata plugin that you can allow your enterprises to include that would have it pre-configured? So you make your generic plugin, you build your update site, and then when you go to deploy, you say, cool, if you add this extra feature, if this extra plugin, or update this plugin in some way, or just leverage metadata in the P2 language, you would actually allow that your plugin now to come up ready to go, so that all the developers in that enterprise that install your plugin are connecting to the local resources, the local repositories that they're supposed to be using. Again, if you think like the Mylin setup, a lot of people come in and have to, okay, everyone on the team is going to have to configure it, know where things are, and your users won't always know where things are. So build that flexibility in. So that's it. We're right at 30 minutes, which is what I was asked to speak to. So at this point, we can answer any questions. We are actually giving away a raffle, like right after this, before the closing session. We're going to go outside and do the raffle. The only parting thought is Eclipse is awesome. Leverage the frameworks. Leverage everything you've learned about this week. If you do that right, you choose mature products, you'll succeed. So questions? Thank you.